Hello, my name is Brant Hunt, and today is still the 16th day of February, and going to share some information. Actually, yeah, it's the 16th, uh, from the book called American Design, Engineer Declined by William Norman Greer, Grigg. Going to talk about some important information here so you can see what is happening and has happened in the last 30 to 40 years, how this has been dealing with. The chapter is chapter 5. It is electing a new people. This is a quote from If the government doesn't like the people, why doesn't it dissolve them and elect the new people? Marxist playwright Bertolt Brecht, Brecht, 1953. I meant to tell you, my videos are actually discerning what is true, and I'm actually on the chapter dealing with electing new people. And then what I was going to tell you something was that I'm on Odyssey, YouTube, and this is a continued work with American Engineered Decline. Illegal immigrants are a nation within a nation, society within a society that alone possesses the numerical and positional strength to undermine the American empire from within. This nation within a nation can act to bring socialism to North America by virtue of a combined hemispheric process of revolt that overlaps boundaries and interlaces movements. This is Marxist theoretician Mike Davis in Prisoners of the American Dream. Another quote here. A peaceful mass of people carries out slowly and patiently an unstoppable invasion, the most important in a human's history. The invasion seems to be slowly returning the southwestern United States to the jurisdiction of Mexico without the firing of a single shot, nor requiring the least diplomatic action by means of a steady, spontaneous, and uninterrupted occupation. Mexican commentator Carlos Loret Mola, written in Exclusio, 1982. Another quote. Mexico is a friend of America. Mexico is our neighbor. We want our neighbors to succeed. We want our neighbors to do well, and that's why it's so important for us to tear down barriers and walls that might separate Mexico from the United States. President George W. Bush addressed to the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce at the Albuquerque, New Mexico. President George W. Bush did this January 7, 2004, announced an ambitious plan to extend amnesty to millions or tens of millions of illegal immigrants, triggered a sudden rush on our southern border. The U.S. Border Patrol marks January 7th as the day of illegal crossing numbers surge, reported in the American Star Dispatch from Hermosillo, a Mexican border town frequently used as a jumping off point for illegal immigration. Mexicans arrive by the border by foot, bus, and train. Mexicana Airlines and 3 other Mexican air carriers have thoughtfully arranged special flights that carries hundreds of border jumpers to Hermosillo each day. Once there, these seeking to enter the U.S. illegally often place themselves in the care of an immigrant smuggler known as coyotes. Hundreds die each year as they try to make the dangerous desert crossing into Arizona to search for work. A similar amnesty rush ensued across the southwestern border at San Ysidro Port of Entry, the world's largest land-based border crossing. Border Patrol officials noted a sharp increase in the use of fraudulent identification papers in the immediate aftermath of President Bush's announcement. How did they know this, folks? Why did it occur on the same day? Why did it happen on that day? Think about it. More than half of these were caught with counterfeit documents, admitted that the amnesty offers induced them to attempt to enter the U.S. illegally. Who is doing this? Who is really sponsoring this? We know they're doing it, but who's behind it? You see, not surprisingly, active and former Border Patrol agents were less than enamored of the Bush amnesty proposal. Everybody thinks it's a slap in the face, commented San Diego-based agent T.J. Bonner, head of the 10,000-member Border Patrol Council. The Council Vice President John Frecker, Frecker, concurred in that view, noting further in a letter to the Border Patrol agents that the amnesty proposal implies that the country really wasn't serious about immigration control in the first place, in spite of what you were told about the big picture, you see. Agents of the U.S. Border Patrol carry out a vital and unique role by literally guarding our nation's frontiers against foreign invasion. In line of duty, the men who compose the thin green line of the Border Patrol face hardship, danger, and occasional death at the hands of drug and alien smugglers. Agents are often called on to provide medical care to people cruelly abandoned to their fate by the venal, corrupt coyotes. The Border Patrol work is difficult and largely thankless, even at the best of times. And amnesty for a illegal alien makes that job almost impossible. In 1986, we had the first amnesty. You know who that was under? That was under, you know who? Ronald Reagan. It was supposed to be a one-shot deal, pointed out retired Border Patrol agent Mike Cutler. At the time, the illegal alien population was estimated at roughly 3 to 6 million people. By 2004, it has increased to at least 8 to 12 million. Folks, those are conservative numbers. It's just worse than that. And these people produce, folks. That's what they do. They get in bed and they produce. This reflects the unfortunate reality that crime unpunished is crime rewarded. The 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act, IRCA, offers what was supposed to be a limited amnesty, coupled with reinvigorated efforts to enforce immigration laws. But IRCA actually created a huge influx of unassimilated migrants as newly legalized aliens began to import their relatives through the process of chain immigration. At the same time, the measure amnesty provisions sent a clear signal that our government has no credible interest in enforcing our nation's immigration laws. No, they don't. Thus, the number of legal aliens grew unchecked. And in 1986, IRC amnesty eventually begat the 2004 Bush amnesty. And even as they girded up to deal with the consequences of the latest amnesty rush, Border Patrol agents were ordered not to discuss developments that would affect negatively on the Bush plan. A memo sent by the Customs and Border Patrol headquarters in Washington ordered agents do not speculate about the program, do not provide statistics on apprehensive spikes or past amnesty dates. When apology to Tennyson, Tennnyson, these agents were told, in effect, theirs was not to question why, theirs was but to watch out our nation die. Borders, after all, are indispensable to defining national identity, as are enforcing laws, a shared language, and a common public culture. The Bush amnesty was a direct assault on these indispensable traits of an independent nation. Come one, come all. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about the Bush amnesty plan was the president insisted that it wasn't amnesty at all. The plan is not amnesty placing undocumented workers on the automatic path of citizenship, says President Bush during a press conference with Mexican President Vicente Fox. I oppose amnesty because it encourages the violation of our laws and perpetuates illegal immigration. Excuse me, what are you talking about? You see. But the unavoidable reality of the Bush proposal is that it would reward those who broke our immigration law. They would be allowed to jump the query and retain legal status ahead of millions of people who followed our laws, many of whom spent years in their quest for citizenship. Despite his guest worker plan, the Bush amnesty proposal included legal status as a temporary worker for the millions of undocumented men and women now employed in the United States, and to those in foreign countries who seek to participate in the program and have been offered employment here. A 3-year renewable grant of legal status, an increase in the annual allotment of green cards that can lead to citizenship for legal aliens, and an increase in the limits on legal immigration, which President Bush insists was too low. In announcing his proposal, President Bush was flanked by representatives of Hispanic lobbying groups, including the Radical League of United Latin American Citizens. He's referred to as Tony Garza, Garza, the administrative ambassador to Mexico, as El Embajador of Mexico, a bizarre and puzzling way to refer to an official who supposedly represents our nation's interests abroad. But the entire thrust of Mr. Bush's announcement was that America has the obligation to provide economic help to foreigners. No, we don't. No, we don't. Including those who violate our national laws. Immigration reforms must begin by confronting a basic fact of life and economics. Some of the jobs being generated in America's growing economy are jobs American citizens are not filling, he intoned. One of common sense and fairness, our laws should allow workers to enter our country and fill jobs that Americans are not filling. Well, the reason why those people are not working those jobs, Mr. Bush, is because they don't pay anything. Get it? We have to pay our way. If an American employer is offering a job that American citizens are not willing to take, we ought to welcome into our country a person who will fill that job. You've got to be kidding me. The entire purpose of the immigration system, he concludes, should be to match willing foreign workers with willing American employers when no Americans can be found to fill the jobs. And the reason why people don't work those jobs most of the time is they're not fulfilling. Two is simply they don't pay anything, and yet you still have to pay taxes in this country. You see, get it? While the other people brought in, everything's given to them if they can make it. In reality, there are a few jobs that can attract Americans employees if the price they offer wage is suitable. Yeah, just what I just said. Throwing open the American labor markets to hordes of desperate immigrants from Mexico, Central America, the Middle East, Asia with artificial depressed wages. The result will be either a huge influx of low-wage foreign labor, which is what's taking place, a rapid decline of living standards on the part of Americans willing to work for third world wages, or both. See, this is what it's about. It's destroying the infrastructure. And we're getting the worst, folks. I'm just going to be very clear. Um, a lot of these people come here, some work. I grant you the Mexicans, they work. I'm not saying that. So it's all a matter of supply and demand, point out Steve Saylor, president of Human Biodiversity Institute, as they teach you during the first week of Econ 101. When the supply of labor goes up, the price wages go down. The only restriction the Bush administration are talking about is that the job offerings to foreigners must meet the minimum wage. That's at that time was $5.15 per hour, or $10,712 for a full-time worker. Members of the opinion molding class are largely indifferent to these realities. Saylor notes, massive immigration is vastly more popular among the elites than among the public. Lawyers, politicians, and business executives won't find their pay driven down much by increased competition. On the other hand, if I was, say, a carpenter, I'd be horrified at what the President of the United States is planning to do to me and my family. What the global average wage made by carpenters, I'd be surprised if it was more than 33% of the average American carpenter's wage, and I wouldn't be shocked if it were only 10% as much. Thus, in addition to legalizing a huge pool of illegal immigrants, setting the stage for another round of chain immigration, the Bush amnesty proposal would amount to a global job fair, with the American labor market thrown open to low-wage workers from every nation. With high-tech and manufactured jobs fleeing the United States and millions of low-skilled workers flooding in, what would America look like a decade from now? Homeland insecurity. Saylor describes the Bush amnesty plan as a globalist libertarian fantasy. It's essentially identity to the Wall Street Journal editorial page long campaign for its constitutional amendment reading, "There shall be open borders." Curious, however, the Bush administration and the globalist elite it serves are concerned about preserving some national borders, just not our own, you see. It's all double take, folks. You see, we'll go over and fight over a country and do all this stuff to protect our such borders, but yet we allow them to be open here. 2 years after the devastating 9/11 terrorist assault on our nation's borders remain terrifying, insecure, and our wounded economy continues to shed manufacturing jobs. Assessing this grim situation, the political class in Washington focuses intently on the task of rebuilding critical wounded economic infrastructure and enhancing border security. In Iraq, an annual budget deficit staggered to unprecedented depths. That is, the Bush administration requested an emergency appropriation of $87 billion to fund the occupation and reconstruction of a war-ravaged Mesopotamia colony. $20 billion of that amount was earmarked to address critical needs for security infrastructure in Iraq, such as the national electric, water, sewage, telecommunication systems, as well as housing, roads, and bridges. Hundreds of millions of dollars were to be spent on private sector business initiative and job training programs. So what they did simply is I'm going to make it very clear. We go in and destroy a country, and then we basically come back in and build their infrastructure and build it back for them. So, it makes no fucking sense unless you want to destroy your own country. And it also kills people, which is not what I recommend. All life is valuable, no matter whose. While American taxpayers drowning in debt, ravaged by inflation, and anxious over their own employment prospects should pay to train Iraqi workers. The Bush administration didn't deem this plain. Yeah, they're above the report, you see. More than $2 million was requested by Iraq colonial administration to fund public safety, including police and border enforcement. The Iraqi Provisional Authority pleaded for $150 million to train new Iraqi border control and custom officials, as well as to refurbish scores of border outposts. Without this investment, insisted the authority requested, the nation will continue to be as a tremendous risk of penetration by members of terrorist cells and other subversive organizations. Smuggling will continue to bleed the revenue necessary for the Iraqi economy to stand on its own, and Iraq will not be able to control its borders. Remember, John Coleman talks about this big time. It's basically simply it's all about oil. A lot of it's about oil, and we do all the fighting for the corporations. That's what we do. In keeping with his globalist perspective, the Wall Street Journal, one of the key tone-setting organs of the conservative media, editorial endorses the Bush administration's skewed priorities, applauding the amnesty proposal. The journal denounced the nativist right for calling for drastic measures, including, if necessary, the deployment of our military to guard the southern border. As an already stretched army doesn't have enough missions, somehow draining the terror swamp in the Middle East seems a lot more vital to U.S. security than stopping busboys from crossing the Rio Grande. Even assuming that the occupied Iraq was somehow helping to drain the Middle East terror swamp, it's difficult for rational people to see why protecting Iraq borders is more critical to our national security than protecting our own. Yeah, they're protecting the border. That's right. They're protecting it so that they won't come in, those that try to steal the oil. Seriously. One beneficiary of the 1986 IRCA amnesty was terrorist sleeper agent Mohammed Abdul Halim, the ringleader of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. Co-conspirator Mohammed Salameh also applied for amnesty but was turned down, yet perhaps in part because of his bureaucratic burden created by the amnesty, he would still be able to remain in the country for 7 years. In anticipation of this amnesty plan, the Bush administration pressured financial institutions and municipal governments to accept Mexican consular cards as a legitimate identification, despite the fact that they are issued to Mexican immigrants irrespective of their legal status. You talk about people just destroying your own government. They're all these stinking politicians. Doesn't matter who you vote for, people. That's why I tell you to stop the fucking voting. When are you going to wake up? You don't have a choice in this country at all. It's Tweedledee and Tweedledum, but they're both destroying your country. And that's what they want to do. That's what they're doing. Just weeks before President Bush announced his amnesty plan, Himeta Ortiz Abadala, a former Mexican consulate in Lebanon, was arrested and charged with running a immigrant smuggling ring in the United States between 1998 and 2001. Ortiz, aided by Mexican citizen Salim Borajado, a native of Lebanon, smuggled numerous individuals in the United States, including at least one identified as a Muslim extremist. Ortiz's role in the scheme allegedly was to provide fraudulent Mexican passports that is up to $4,500 a copy to Borjado's clients between 1999 and his arrest in November 2002. He was reported smuggling about 300 illegal immigrants from Lebanon to the U.S. Convicted of human trafficking last March, was released and deported to Mexico after serving 10 months. Arrested again in Mexico, now faces up to 30 years in prison on organized crime-related charges. Ironically, Borjado served time in a U.S. prison and faces a lengthy prison term in Mexico, committing exactly the offenses that would be legalized by the Bush administration amnesty plan. And the illegal immigrant ring he created with the help of a Mexican diplomat offered a telling illustration of the potential deadly consequences of undermining our borders. So why does border matter? Why do the borders matter? Even if the United Nations didn't face a grave threat from foreign terrorism, controlling immigration would be vital to the preservation of our free institutions. In his report on immigration to the First Congress, James Madison urged that Americans welcome every person of good fame, who really means to incorporate himself to our society, but repel all who will not be a real addition to the wealth and strength of the United States. To reasonable people, Madison was only stating the obvious. American immigration policy should serve the interests of our nation while preserving its prosperity its independence, its free institutions, and distinctive civil culture. It's what makes countries different, folks. Given that our nation's political system, economic, and cultural institutions are outgrowths of Anglo-European traditions, it's not surprising that for roughly the first 200 years of our national existence, American immigration policy traditionally favored English-speaking immigrants from Europe. You bet, who could adapt themselves to our institutions. Ironically, as it may seem to those of the statist persuasion, the absence of a welfare safety net is another source of social cohesion between the great wave of immigration that occurred between 1890 and 1920. Immigration researcher Peter Brimelow estimated at the turn of the century, 40% of all immigrants went home, basically because they failed in the workforce. Millions of others, often with the help of extended families, religious institutions, and fraternity organizations, found a secure foothold in our nation. They learned our common language, adopted our public culture, and succeeded in the American economy. Many of them, particularly those who have fled poverty, oppression, and persecution, went on to become exceptional, idealistic citizens. This isn't to say, however, that the absence of welfare state allowed the luxury of open borders. The Immigration Acts of 1921 and 24 passed largely in reaction to the social pressures accompanying the Great Wave, or sought to preserve a stable status quo by imposing a national origin quota system. That is, the McCarran-Walter Act of 1952 retained the basic structure of 1924 measure, enhanced with provisions intended to deny admissions to known subversives. The Immigration Reform Act of 1965 completely inverted our nation's border policies by assuming that they should serve the interests of the world rather than our nation. Senator Robert F. Kennedy put this proposition quite plainly during the debate over the measure, insisting that the relevant community is not merely the nation, but all men of goodwill. Wow, there's that communist influence there. The IRA was deliberately designed to increase immigration from non-Western nations. This was accomplished by abolishing the national origin quota system. And although the former immigration quota was raised only slightly, the measure allowed for theoretically unlimited non-quota immigration for refugees, asylum seekers, and relatives of nationalized citizens for purpose of family reunification by a process known as chain immigration. Are you aware that the population in the United States was a little over 200 million people in 1960? Are you aware that now it's probably 350 million? Where do you think that growth is taking place, folks? It surely isn't in our country. Think about it. Think about it. For IRA critics, the measure consequences a flood tide of unassembled immigrants and resulting social turmoil were entirely predictable. Senator Edward Kennedy, Democrat from Massachusetts, who served as Senate floor manager for the Senate version of the IRA, tried to diffuse those objections by offering soothing assurances what the bill supposedly would not do. First, our cities will not be flooded with 1 million immigrants annually. Under the proposed bill, the present hold on here a second. Get to the part here. I'm trying to find it. Level of immigration remains substantially the same. Second, the ethnic mix of the country will not be upset. Contrary to the charges in some quarters, the IRA will not inundate America with immigrants from any one country or area or the most populated and economically deprived nations of Africa and Asia. In the final analysis, the ethnical pattern of immigration under the proposed measure is not expected to change as sharply as the critics seem to think. Not surprisingly, Peter Brimelow observes every one of Senator Kennedy's assurances have proven to be false. Immigration levels did surge upward. They are now, during the mid-1990s, running at around 1 million a year, not counting illegals, folks. Immigrants do come predominantly from one area. Some 85% of the 16.7 million legal immigrants arrived in the United States between 1968 and 1993 came from the Third World. 47% came from Latin America and the Caribbean. 34% came from Asia. Also, immigrants did come disproportionately from one country. 20% of them come from Mexico. In addition to millions of illegal aliens who flood our shores annually, Americans take in more legal immigrants than the rest of the industrial world combined. It's to sure destroy the culture of our society. That's what it's about. Why do you think that all the stations now, everything's printed now in English and Spanish? No, if you come here, you learn the English, period. Frankly, I don't see that happening. Do you? Counter assimilation. It is conceivable that American society could handle even an influx of this magnitude if it weren't for the counter assimilation roles played by the welfare state and the huge racial entitlement industry. Liberal commentator Michael Lind, Lind, who does not reject welfare affirmative action state in principle, points out as a proportion of the U.S. population, the groups eligible for racial preference benefits are rapidly growing thanks to mass immigration from Latin America and Asia. While earlier European immigrants were under the necessity of assimilating quickly, Lind observes that today's Hispanic and Asian immigrants are tempted by a variety of rewards for retaining their distinctive racial identities, even their different languages. The moment a Mexican or Chinese immigrant becomes a nationalized citizen of the United States, he can qualify for special consideration and admission to colleges and universities at the expense of better qualified white Americans. Expect and receive special treatment in employment, apply for minority business subsidies denied to his neighbors, and even demand to have congressional district lines redrawn to maximize the likelihood of electing someone of his race or ethnic group. Building constituents of dependence in a major industry for any welfare state, particularly if its dependents in question are effectively confined to a cultural and linguistic ghetto, yet most immigrants, including those who come here illegally, are inclined to work. Many of them, particularly those from Mexico, work very hard. I give you that. I don't say they don't work. That's not what I'm saying. But where earlier generations of immigrants had to provide for themselves, thereby learning to adapt to our country and society, the present welfare system creates perverse incentives for separatism. It does. That's what it does. It creates division as considerable expense to the taxpayer. In a 1993 study, the economist Donald Huddle, Huddle, of Rice University, documented that immigrants cost the American taxpayer more than $42.5 billion in 1992 alone for services such as a subsidized education, Medicaid, health and welfare services, bilingual education, and other benefits. The cost of welfare subsidies to immigrants between 1993 and 2002, Huddle estimated would average $67 billion per year in 1992 dollars, a net total of $668.5 billion after taxes over the decade. Mexifornia, that is, California absorbs roughly 40% of American immigrants, a fact that contributed significant to the state insolvency and recent gubernatorial recall. Although California immigrants come from Europe, Asia, the former Soviet Union, the Caribbean, and various Latin American nations, simply geographic dictates that the largest percent, especially those who come illegally, arrive from Mexico. Most arrivals are given work by grateful employees, notes Victor Davis Hanson, a professor of classics and farmers who live in Northern California. Although illegal aliens are eager to see a fighting chance to succeed, many are not prepped for nor immersed into the competitive culture that helped demobilize them. Instead, in recent years, their offspring have ended up in ethical enclaves of the mind and burials of the flesh. In those locations, they often soon become dependent on subsidies, and too many of their children will join an underclass to be led by ethical shepherds who often do more harm than good. Counter assimilation pressures abound in California. Many of Hanson's most outstanding students are Americans of Mexican ancestry. They are fluent in English and appreciate of our nation's free institution. Those students eagerly learn of our culture, heritage, and literature, only to find themselves ostracized by many of their peers for displaying inadequate devotion to La Raza, that is the race. This is racist. This is racist, folks. That's what it's all about. A lot of this is to do with it. Hanson records that his Mexican American students, even those of nearly 100% Indian heritage, face hostility from their own ethnical communities when they assimilate. speak perfect English, and prefer Latin and Greek literature to Chicano studies. The embittered militant separatists have been carefully cultivated by the state political and economic establishment. The Mexican American caucus in the legislation demands that state universities by fiat graduate Hispanics at rates compensation with surrounding community racial makeup, notes Hansen. Right and left, working in an uneasy partnership that trumps traditional political affiliation, lobbying for open borders to allow millions to come north. The Wall Street Journal and the Chicano Studies Department agree on open borders. The two parties, for example, reasons of money and power, ignore the social caste bought by millions of illegal aliens. Capitalists count on profits for plentiful cheap workers, while activists expect their laborers to become liberal voters. While this growing pool of cheap labor might seem attractive, it actually incurs substantial costs. In 2003, the average California household was required to pay $1,200 a year to make up the difference between the cost of welfare payments to immigrants and the amount they pay in taxes. Wages to illegals are often paid in cash, which is a bargain for everyone involved, notes Hansen. For instance, at $10 an hour without state, federal, and payroll tax deducted, the worker really earns the equivalent of a gross of $13 an hour or more, while the employer saves over 30% of his payroll contributions in expensive paperwork. Meanwhile, however, such cash payments force other Americans and legal immigrants to pay steeper taxes, in part to cover those who pay none. So the farmer cheering over access to solid, dependable, cheap labor is now learning that he pays more than he thinks for illegal aliens in the form of rising taxes as well as frailing social fabric. Not only are law-abiding Californians forced to subsidize lawbreakers, they are also touched up to create a multi-generational indigent class. At age 50, notes Brimlow, the legal worker is physically worn out and unemployable. His American-born children are alienated high school dropouts. You see, more illegal arrives to do the work that American citizens won't do. The cycle of privatized profits and socialized costs begins anew. My once sleepy hometown of Selma, Selma, California, in the center of San Joaquin Valley, is in the middle of all this, comments Hansen. On our streets, I have no idea whether the mostly young male illegal aliens I meet are economic refugees or fugitives from crime in Mexico, perhaps serious felons, and no one else does either because there is no legal record of their existence. And what documents they and our local authorities possess are almost always fraudulent, forged to mask the condition of their arrival. That is, Selma is now somewhere between 60 and 90% Hispanic. And the gas station a mile away from my farm, I rarely hear English. Almost every car that pull in display a Mexican flag decal somewhere. The Reconquista, California warns Hansen is a harbinger of radical changes being engineered in our nation's culture and political system as we are overrun by the most uneducated and destitute of the entire North American subcontinent. A prospect conjures a looming nightmare of unassimilated third worldism. Mexico is ruled by deeply entrenched oligarchs that a former Mexican foreign minister, Dolores Castaneda, misuses immigration to the United States as a social safety valve. While Mexico eagerly exports its surplus of poverty northward, ferociously guards its southern border. Yes. In 2001, the Mexican government conducted an ambitious program called Plan SUR, S-U-R, intended to seal off Mexico's 600-mile frontier with Guatemala and Belize, as well as the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. In 2000 and 2001, Mexicans deported more than 250,000 illegal immigrants from Central and South America, according to Felipe de Jesus Presidio, head of the Mexican Migration Service. The flow of Central American migrants north is a national security problem for Mexico. It wouldn't be such a big problem if they were getting through to the United States, but they get stuck and hang around in the frontier cities making trouble, sleeping in the streets with no money, you see. From the Mexican regime perspective, the United States has a duty not only to absorb whatever portion of the Mexican population it chooses to send our way, but also to relieve Mexico's own problem with illegal immigration by keeping the borders open to Central American immigrants as well. While President George W. Bush pointedly referred to Mexico as our good friend, the Mexican government could be considered a potential dangerous adversary. Communist China is more powerful, North Korea is better armed, and the post-Soviet Russia remains deeply involved in fomenting subversion and terrorism worldwide. But apart from Mexico, no other foreign power is actively carrying out a plan to occupy and reconquer U.S. territory. Mexico's government actually claims to represent not only its expatriated national within our own border, whether here legally or illegally, but also Americans of Mexican ancestry who were born here and have never set foot in Mexico. And the Mexican ruling elite exploits every opportunity to cultivate public hostility towards the United States. The Mexican newspaper readers and television viewers are regalated constantly with descriptions of the ill treatment of Mexicans in the United States, observed Alan Wall, an American citizen who works as a teacher in Mexico. Americans' attempt to control its own borders are presented as racist, xenophobia, and anti-Mexican. The United States is blamed for deaths of illegal aliens who die across the border in the desert. Mexican politicians have called the border a slaughterhouse and a modern Nazi zone. Yeah, these are good old communist people here, folks, getting paid. People say whatever they want to say because where they're getting paid. That's why the whole fracturization of the whole world is coming apart. This is all about money, you see. People do anything for money. In Mexico, all political parties support increased Mexican immigration to the United States, amnesty for illegal aliens, and government benefits for Mexicans in the United States, Wall contends. In fact, very few influential Mexican public acknowledge the right of the U.S. to their own border. Legal aliens are not. They only do the work the gringos won't do, and they are obliged to cross the border. These are a common slogan used to justify illegal immigration. Many prominent Mexicans often speak of la reconciliación, that is, the reconquest of the southwestern United States, portions of which were for a short time Mexican territories during the early 19th century. His article, published more than 2 decades ago in Excusión, a Mexican analog of the New York Times, column Carlos Larrea de Morto, described the outpouring of Mexican immigrants in the United States as a great invasion. The peaceful mass of people carries out slowly and patiently an unstoppable invasion. The most important is human history, yet cannot give me a similar example of such a large migrated way by ant-like multitudes, stubborn, unarmed, and carried on in the face of the most powerful and best armed nation in the nation on the earth. Neither barbed wire fences, nor aggressive border guards, nor campaign, nor laws, no police raids against the undocumented have stopped this movement of the masses. That's unprecedented in any part of the world. According to Lorette, L-O-R-E-T, the migrant invasion seems to be slowly returning the southwestern United States to the jurisdiction of Mexico without firing a single shot, not requiring the least diplomatic action by means of a steady, spontaneous, and uninterrupted occupation. Notion that those U.S. territories are returning to jurisdiction of Mexico is an allusion to the concept that California, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Texas, the states created in the territory obtained from Mexico through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, composed Aztlan, the miracle homeland of the Aztec Indians. For decades, Chicano militants, many of them underwritten by establishment tax-exempt foundations such as the Ford Foundation, have demanded that the territory Aztlan be taken back from the United States. Among the most radical of these groups are the campus-based Movimiento, this MECHA, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, and the National Council of La Raza, and the League of United Latin American Citizens. These groups are all tightly linked with the Mexican government as well. During a June 2001 address to the annual convention of LULAC, George Castañeda praised the group for efforts to lobby Washington on behalf of the Mexican government, and according to an account in the Mexican press, urged LULAC convention goers to lobby U.S. legislators to push for immigration accords. Under President Vicente Fox, the Mexican government created a cabinet-level office called the National Council for Mexicans Abroad, headed by an official who has dual citizenship in the United States and Mexico. The council's purpose, according to Fox, was to act as a liaison between the Mexican president and the 23 million of Mexicans in the U.S. That number includes American citizens of Mexican ancestry. And Mexico uses its 48 consulates on U.S. soil to meddle in our domestic policies and mobilize Mexican Americans on behalf of its foreign government. In 1994, a Mexican consulate in Los Angeles helped organize resistance to Proposition 187, a ballot measure seeking to deny non-emergency welfare benefits to illegal aliens. In Houston, the Mexican consulate, along with officials from the U.S. Department of Labor, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and the radical group MALDEF, M-A-L-D-E-F, participated in a consortium to educate and advise immigrants who considered themselves victims of discrimination in matters of immigration, employment, or wages. Teodoro Moss, M-A-U-S, Mexican Consulate General in Atlanta, publicly opposed the designation of English as Georgia's official language. He's also led campaigns to reprimand local political leaders and even radio talk shows whose comments were deemed anti-Mexicans. These are strong. These are Marxist folks. That's what these people are. The Foundation 1000, that is the 1999/2000 director, shows a typical Ford Foundation grant of $1.325 million to MALDEF, M-A-L-D-E-F, a radical group promoting Aslan. That's right. Electing a new people. Although the impact of unchecked immigration from Mexico is felt primarily in the southwestern U.S., it has had an unmistakable and largely ignored impact on our nation's political landscape. Illegal immigration has distorted the electoral map by redistricting seats in the House of Representatives. Apportionments of congressional seats is based on census figures, which includes sometimes through the use of dubious statistical sampling methods, illegal immigrants. The results from the 2000 census caused Indiana, Michigan, and Mississippi to lose a congressional seat. Montana, which has long had a single seat, failed to acquire a second one, as has been expected. Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Kentucky, and Utah also had one fewer congressional seat than they would have were it not for the presence of non-citizens. California, New York, Florida, and Texas, one of which have had large, growing population of assimilated alien migrants, all gained congressional seats. So these are all southern, well, not all southern. They're big states, the four big ones, population-wise. Because Florida's four, Texas is second, I think. California's one. No, I think it's Texas is second. California's number one, and New York's probably, maybe New York's bigger than Texas. I can't remember. Anyway, get to the point. This immigration-induced redistribution of political influence takes away representatives from states composed almost entirely of U.S. citizens and results in the creation of new districts in states with large numbers of non-citizens, as comments the Center for Immigration Reform. In the 9 states that lost a seat due to the presence of non-citizens, only 1 in 50 residents is a non-citizen. In contrast, 1 in 7 residents, a non-citizen, is in California, which picked up 6 of the resigned seats. 1 in 10 residents is a non-citizen in New York, Texas, and Florida. In California, 31st congressional district, 43% of all residents are non-citizens. Nationwide, roughly 40% of all Hispanics are non-citizens, as commentator John J. Miller observes, packing them into congressional districts threatening to recreate the notorious rotten boroughs of 18th century England, in which only a handful of people were eligible to vote. Non-citizen apportionment has delivered something very much like this to our own shores, though we might call them rotten barrels, states Miller. Thanks in some measure in the influence of rotten barrels, the electoral landscape for presidential politics will be altered, since votes in electoral college are based on the size of congressional delegation. During the run-up to the 1996 presidential election, the Clinton administration took a more direct approach to altering the landscape by hurriedly nationalizing more than 1 million immigrants in politically critical states. Get it? Through the Citizen USA program administered by Vice President Al Gore, hundreds of thousands of applicants for naturalization were rushed through the naturalization process in disregard of normal procedures and legal standards such as criminal background checks, records former Congressman Bob Barr. This allowed a flood of immigrants to gain citizenship without meeting the standard INS procedures. Nearly 180,000 immigrants, including an estimated 11,000 with prior felony arrests, were made citizens without undergoing required FBI background checks. And the INS deportation officers who had left the Citizen USA program and discussed complaint to the Chicago Tribune, they're not stopping people the way we used to. The big initiative is to get all these people eligible to vote and register. It's just a rush for numbers. The cynical effort to undermine our national identity in search of a political advantage brings to mind Bertolt Brecht's sarcastic reaction to East Germany in 1953 crackdown on labor unrest. If the government doesn't like the people, why doesn't it dissolve them and elect a new people? Obviously, the immediate political beneficiaries of unchecked immigration are the architects and custodians of the welfare state. But it shouldn't be thought that the liberal Democrats are alone in their enthusiasm for open borders. Next section is called merging with Mexico. Whatever else George W. Bush does or doesn't do, commented Newsweek political analyst Howard Feynman in late 2001, he's earned a place in history as the first American president to place Hispanic voters at the center of politics and the first to view the land between Canada and Guatemala as one. Kind of makes you wonder, what country does he really represent, does it? Remember, folks, all he did was a lot of show business. It makes sense if you think about it. Texas, long ago, far away, was part of Mexico. Now the Texan is trying to resemble the old country and then some. Feynman's history is rather faulty, though. Texas was part of Mexico in the same sense as the 13 American colonies were part of England. Like the American colonies, the Texans fought a war of independence that grew out of an effort to vindicate their constitutional rights. In their case, rights promised under the Mexican 1824 Constitution. Texas wasn't part of the old country when it was admitted to the Union, but rather an independent republic. That's correct. But Feynman was absolutely right in saying that the policy promoted by the Bush administration was the amalgamated the entire hemisphere. During the August of 2001 state visit of Vicente Fox to the United States, President Bush convened a meeting of the U.S.-Mexico Binational Commission, a cabinet-level body in which officials from both national governments developed joint policies of such issues as immigration, counter-narcotic efforts, trade, energy, and foreign policy. In 1993, on the NAFTA framework, the U.S. and Mexico established the Border Environmental Cooperative Commission and the North American Development Bank. Although the NAD Bank was originally designed to finance the environmental initiatives at the border, the Fox administration demanded to use the bank to subsidize projects in non-environmental sectors and in a wider geographic zone. To use the delicate language of the White House press release, in an interview published in September 4, 2001, Washington Post, Fox claimed that using the NAD Bank to subsidize economic development in Mexico is justified by the broad spirit of cooperation as well as justice and equity. This is to say that Mexico sees a NAD bank and a U.S. taxpayers subsidized PENA. But this isn't all. During Fox's visit, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution noted that Fox envisions a North American economic alliance that will make the border between the United States and Mexico as unrestricted as the one between Tennessee and Georgia. Of course, Tennessee and Georgia are not separate independent countries, but states in the same constitutional union. This implies the United States and Mexico, as well as Canada, will cede their sovereignty to a new supranational political union, prospectively warmly endorsed by the Journal-Constitution of Atlanta. You wonder what these people really work for. You wonder who they're defending. The ultimate goal of any White House policy ought to be a North American economic political alliance similar in scope and ambition to the EU, opinion that is based upon the Journal-Constitution. House Divide editorial based in September 7th. Unlike the varied landscape and cultures of the European Union members, the United States, Canada, and Mexico already share a great deal in common, and language is not as great a barrier. President Bush, for example, is quite comfortable with the blended Mexico-Anglo culture force in the border states of Texas, California, and Arizona. Fundamentally, economic integration with Mexico is inedible, insists Jagdish Shil of Emory University, speaking to U.S.-Mexico convergence. Georgia State University economist David Sergisius declares our choice is to fight it and lose or embrace it and come out better for it. These people are at war with Americans. They really are. They have been fed some kind of garbage that we are bad people or we spoil people. Maybe we are. But the point simply doesn't justify you coming to our country, you see. Essentially, this is the argument from inedibility, a tactic preferred by rapists seeking to minimize their victims' resistance. It's going to happen anyway, so you might as well hold still and enjoy it. That's correct. That's what they do. President Bush prefers to dress up that argument with a layer of humanitarian gloss. There are people in Mexico who's got children who worry about where they're going to get their next meal from, asserted the president. And they're going to come to the United States. That's a simple fact, and we've got to respect that. That's the attitude. It's a whole James Bond. It's a complete different ball of different wax here. But as noted above, the hardship of ordinary Mexicans is largely a result of that nation's embedded criminal ruling elite, correct, which uses immigration to the U.S. as a means of forestalling the desperate needed reforms. That elite has been supported for decades by U.S. foreign policy and foreign aid. Is the intent is to make life better for Mexico's long-suffering people? No. Turning the U.S. into a combination public works project, welfare hostile for Mexicans won't work. It will, however, succeed in harmonizing Americans down to Mexico's economic level. Correct. During the 2001 summit, President Bush and Fox laid the groundwork for the so-called Partnership for Prosperity, an initiative designed to use American tax dollars to build Mexico's manufacturing sector. Wow. Like most international socialist undertakings of this sort, the Partnership for Prosperity was formally inaugurated at a UN Global Conference, specifically the March 2002 UN Foreign and Conference in Monterrey, Mexico. According to the U.S. State Department, the Peace for Prosperity Action Plans calls for U.S. assistance in Mexico to boost investment in housing and commercial infrastructure to boost Mexico's productivity. That's their business, not ours. We're not there to prop it up, folks. A key outgrowth of this the Partnership for Prosperity was a bilateral agreement signed to permit the Overseas Private Investment Bureau, OPIC, to offer all its programs and services in Mexico. OPIC was established by Congress to help U.S. companies invest overseas by granting direct loans or loans guaranteed for investment and extending insurance to cover the risk of investment. CEO Peter S. Watson boasted that the bilateral agreement with Mexico will help to further unleash the entrepreneur capacity of Mexican business by mobilizing U.S. capital, consequently bringing important development benefits to the Mexican people. It will also allow OPIC to work freely along with its sister agencies, the U.S. Trade and Development Agency and the Export-Import Bank of the U.S. is providing investment supports in Mexico. In brief, the OPIC and its sister agencies are using taxpayers' money and the full faith and credit of the U.S. government to promote the relocation of manufactured jobs from the U.S. to Mexico, even as Washington keeps both our borders and the welfare spigot open to invaders from the south. The whole Ichiana are nothing. Within the framework for the PIP prospect for progress, President Bush and Fox pledged that they would strive to consolidate a North American economic community whose benefits reach the lesser developed areas of the region and extend to the most vulnerable social groups in our countries. Within a few, probably these are all social programs. That's what it is, folks. It never actually gets down even to those people who really need it. Within a few months of their declaration, the Mexican government had composed a 5-point program to hasten consolidation with the U.S. Here are the points. Legalization of undocumented workers, that is, illegal aliens from Mexico. Expanded permanent visa program. Enhanced guest worker visa program. Border control cooperation. Economic development in immigrant sending regions of Mexico. The list of demands, according to the Mexican Foreign Minister Jorge Castillo, was essentially non-negotiable. He's insisting that the U.S. had to accept the whole enchilada or nothing. The problem, of course, is that there was nothing for the U.S. on that list apart from empty assurance of border control cooperation from Mexico City. Why are our leaders such pansies? Why do they go along with this? They're not serving you, people. They're not. They're not. They're in cahoots with some other foreigners. In exchange for that useless promise, the U.S. was expected to grant amnesty to illegal immigrants, take on a new wave of legal resident aliens, and lavish the economic aid on Mexico. Most of this money is going back in their hands to rich people. It's not even helping anybody. Incredible as it may seem, the Bush administration was on board. So the Partners for Prosperity, taxpayers in our country were being shaken down to underwrite economic development south of the border. Amnesty for illegal aliens were all but a done deal. Then came 9/11. For more than a year after Black Tuesday, the amnesty proposal rested on the proverbial back burner. But in July of 2003, 3 Republican members of Arizona congressional delegation, Senator John McCain, Congressman Jim Koblek, and Jeff Flake, took up the proposal anew by introducing guest worker bills intended to legalize illegal immigrants currently employed in the U.S. That is, do you realize that? These are 3 Republican members of Arizona congressional delegation. You got 2 congressmen, you got a senator. And they all, with the Arizona, which has enormous issues with that, they're not even protecting their people, folks. Did you know this? Do you know what happened? There's a wolves, and these are terrible people, folks. These politicians don't deserve anything. The Immigration Guest Worker Program was essentially allowed the entire legal alien population in this country to apply for permanent legal residence, provided that the applicant had an employer or a family sponsor. There would also be no limit to the number of guest workers admitted annually. In short, the measure was designed to reward those who, by national immigration law, are effectively demolishing any limit on legal immigration. President Bush, head of the administration, so concerned about the security of Iraq borders, reportedly told Senator McCain and Representative Kobe and Flake that he was enthusiastic about the guest worker program, that enactment of the program would be a high priority. To complement the amnesty proposal from above, the radical left organized a nationwide protest intended to demonstrate pressure from below, dubbed the Immigration Workers' Freedom Ride. The fall 2003 campaign was reminiscent of the civil rights struggle of the 1960s, claimed the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. No, it wasn't. No, it wasn't. The protests attract busloads of riders, most of them from Mexico, Central America, and Colombia, who converged on Washington, D.C. before heading to a final rally in New York City. A delegation from the event paid a visit to Atlanta to lay a wreath at the grave of Martin Luther King Jr., thereby symbolically claiming the slain activist mantle. The campaign in calling for immigration reform that will open a path for legalization for immigrants already here permitted their families in foreign countries to join them and protect the rights of workers regardless of their legal status, reported the paper. The campaign is supported by a coalition of labor unions, religious groups, and civil rights activists. Arguably, the most critical omission in the Journal-Constitution story had to do with the role of the Communist Party and other subversive groups in organizing the Immigrant Workers' Freedom Ride. The event website conspicuously lists the Communist Party USA among its sponsors and provided a link to the party's website. It's impossible to believe that the paper or any other similar mainstream media organ would decline to mention the involvement of, for example, the Ku Klux Klan in a similar campaign. The advertised purpose of the Freedom Ride was to demand that legal immigrants in the country receive immediately amnesty for breaking our national laws and be allowed to bring in their extended families in the name of family reunification. This process could conceivably result in our nation being inundated by tens of millions of unassimilated foreigners. Indeed, this has happened before. In 1977, then President Jimmy Carter declared that human rights are not individual rights. Please get that in your head. That's a UN word. Consideration dictated general amnesty for foreigners illegal in the United States, a population then numbering in the millions. The radical proposal was endorsed in 1980 by a special commission on immigration headed by Theodore Hesburgh. The panel recommended a general amnesty for illegal aliens, coupled with employer sanctions and a modest increase in funding for border enforcement. Those recommendations were incorporated in the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, IRCA, which was sold to anxious American public as a definite solution to the crisis of illegal immigration. But rather than migrating the immigration onslaught, the IRCA simply abetted it by opening up the process of chain immigration and sending a potent signal that our borders could be violated with impunity. One nation under NAFTA/FTAA. Shortly after the conclusion of fall 2003 Freedom Ride, representatives of the radical groups sponsored that demonstrated were brought to Washington by Senator John McCain and several of his colleagues to lobby directly for the passage of the disguised amnesty measure. Mexican President Vicente Fox did his part by visiting 3 southwestern states, that is Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico, to lobby state legislatures to support amnesty drive. What the hell is he doing here? Why is he lobbying? He's not even an American citizen. We share the nation language, Fox told the New Mexico legislature. In addition to our geographic vicinity, we are united by inseparable bonds, history, values, and interests. We must join together. You need Mexico and Mexicans, and we need you. Acting as a supposed leader of the Mexicans living abroad. Fox demanded that lawmakers in this country facilitate access to health care and education service for all those who share our borders. Without this, it is impossible to think about the path to greater integration and shared prosperity. Open borders, amnesty for illegals, subsidies for Mexico's economy, exporting manufacturing capacity south of the border, expanding welfare benefits for foreigners who enter our nation illegally. These are all part of the same simplest design, as Fox himself put it, that designed the integration of the U.S. and Mexico in the hemisphere-wide political union. Foreign Affairs analyst Robert D. Kaplan points out that the tumultuous historical constellation of Mexico and the United States is just one facet of a process of global political convergence into a kind of a loose world governance, you see. As these two vastly unequal societies, the United States and Mexico, integrate at a breakneck speed, the immediate result will be social upheaval on both sides of the border. Social upheaval is a remarkable antiseptic term to describe the loss of our national identity. The importance of criminals and welfare parasites, the depression of our labor markets, and an exportation of our manufacturing capacity, and the forcible downward harmonization of our living standards with that of Mexico. But from the perspective of the globalist elite, that is a view that Kaplan enthusiastically shares, this is simply the price that must be paid to bring about a unified world. So that concludes this particular chapter, chapter 5. And you can see this is the structure. This is not what is happening. In a lot of ways, folks, Europe is being destroyed, and so is the United States, and it's at a rapid speed. It's happening. And the whole idea is what is really going on here is that we have separate cultures and social things in each area. They're mixing the pot. They want division. They want the pot to not melt, but they want it to fight one another. That's what they're doing. Because you have two different ways of viewing things here. And one's going to have to give in and one's going to have to fight, whatever is what's happening. And they're doing this on purpose. It's not by accident. Again, there are no accidents, folks. There's no coincidences, as what I would call Mr. Franklin D. Roosevelt spoke about. So that is my conclusion tonight of the sharing from this particular book, America's Engineered Decline. These people have done some really dirty things, and they're all politicians. It doesn't matter what political party they're involved in, folks. It doesn't. We've been asleep at the wheel for a long time. This has been occurring since the 1960s, when the Kennedy amendments were brought in to bring in more illegal aliens, at that point, immigrants. And again, like I said, where is the population growth taking place? Now, you've got to ask your question to yourself. If the black population is not barely moving up, so they're not having as many people as they normally are self-producing, the white population is no longer growing. It's stunted. It's getting older, and there are less and less white people. And the blacks are not increasing that much neither. So where is the population growth taking place at? It's taking place with groups that are foreigners. This is foreigners are coming in our country in large numbers, and they're going to outnumber the minorities very soon. And that's what they want, the people who supposedly represent us. So my point here simply is to educate you to understand what is happening to us as Americans. But it's not only happening in America, it's happening in Europe, it's happening in Australia, New Zealand. It's happening everywhere where I would call where the white population used to dominate is now being amalgamized. It's being destroyed on purpose. And the white population is no longer increasing in population. They're no longer having more than 2.2 It's not only happening here, but the Japanese are not actually doing the same thing. They're not growing either. Their population is dropping too. Why is that? Why is the countries what we call the industrial power countries? All these are industrial power countries. We're talking about America, we're talking about Canada, we're talking about all the countries presently in Europe, also in Japan, which is the only group that's not what I would call white, and also in Australia and New Zealand. The only areas that are not being dealt with would be what we call the former Soviet Union, Russia. And that's it. You think about, look at the population, where the population lives, and see where certain colors are. And I'm not against any colors here, folks, but every group has its own customs and culture. That's the way it is. So what they're doing is they're forcing something to happen. And that's what this particular book here, as I was talking about earlier, this is their ideas. They're going to make this work. That's what they were talking about. Vicente Fox, the former president of Mexico, they're going to make it work. They're going to force it down your throat, you see, and they've been doing that. And most of us are unaware, or we don't want to see it, but it is happening right before our eyes. And again, how's a country that was self-sufficient, 1960, a little over 200 million people, where there was jobs for people, good jobs, and now approximately, I'm guessing close to this, well, we know it's 330 million, but that doesn't include what I would call many people here that are here illegally. So I'm guessing it's 350. Where's the growth been taking place? It's not in our borders, folks. The population growth here with the black population, the white population, since that point is not much growth taking place. It's foreigners coming in our country. That's what it is. And them having children here. You see, and to destroy that. And it's the same thing that's happening in Europe. I don't care what you think. They're migrating people into Europe that are actually, again, from Africa to create issues, to create problems. You see, this is a forced deal. This is a forced immigration policy upon these countries. And I don't know how bad it is in Australia or New Zealand. I do know that simply there are people there that are probably coming in from China and from areas such as Vietnam and other Indochina areas. But you can see that something's going on here, and it's going to be life changing for a lot of us. And it's kind of scary in a lot of ways. And I have people who have told me that they want to, I've had people I've talked to, they want to get rid of borders. They see the nation state as the bad thing. Unfortunately, people, they don't understand. Once the nation states are gone, it's world government. You're going to be ruled you're going to be ruled and you're going to be destroyed. And it's just a simple fact. They're made it very clear what their aims are. They're sticking it right in your face. And I cannot believe that people who are really dumbed down or don't want to know anything, who are against nation states, you see, because they've been brainwashed. They believe that what they're about, they don't understand simply is that once this is a collapse of civilization. This is the collapse of the civilization, especially European civilization. It's the collapse of it. I'm not saying that some of these countries did the right thing in the past. That's not what I'm saying here. But that was the minority of people. It's not the majority. And what Britain did to India is unconscionable, folks, because they went in there and they destroyed that country. They robbed it. It's just something you got to realize simply is that there's enormous there's a war going on, and it's to destroy a certain group of people, although it's going to destroy all people. It's to eliminate those who can think and actually stand up against the system. That's what they want to do. They want to destroy that because once that's over with, there's total capitulation. There's no one going to stand up for them because no one knows what's going on. That's why I'm sharing this information because I see the seeds for the future. That's all I'm doing is planting seeds. I'm 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 forecasting them. I'm throwing them out, such and such, hoping that people will pick up and understand and see that what is taking place is alarm bells. Because I'm 62 years old, so I'm not going to be here a long, long time. But I'm thinking about the 20-year-olds, the 30-year-olds, and the 40-year-olds, and even those that are very young that have no idea what's going on in this country because they've basically been they haven't been educated. They don't understand what's going on. They been caught up with what I call all kinds of things that basically keep them from looking in the mirror and seeing that life is going to change. Life is changing dramatically. It's occurring very rapidly. So anyway, I need to go to bed. It's almost 1 o'clock. So here on the East Coast. Anyway, I appreciate you being here. Thank you for listening. And again, you have a good night. You take care.